Yes. Delightful. Well, hello everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Welcome once again to the Milwaukie Leadership Academy. We are here tonight to hear about urban planning and about community development. I'm going to let those departments tell you more about what it is that they do, but this is, I think, one of the more impactful sessions that we do every year. The way that the city is shaped, the way that the city grows, what can be done in what area, what the possibilities are in a lot of ways bounded by the zoning decisions and the planning decisions that are being made right now. And not just because we're in comp plan implementation. When they get into the difference between long-term planning and shorter-term planning, and they have better words for it, I think you're going to really see the way that that helps to shape a city. So with that, I am going to go ahead and start sharing. And let me see if I can do that. Home and slideshow and present. Don't need any of that stuff, just need to play it. All right. And with that, let's bring up Zoom. And of course, Zoom is now hiding from me, so let's drop that again, and we will try that once more.
Morgan and I should just play our guitars at this interval.
I think so. You know, we do this every single month, and I really appreciate everybody's patience because we are going to share from beginning, and of course it's the wrong one, so we're going to do swap. Did that do it? Did I get there? Or was it better before?
It's telling us we're being recorded.
Perfect. But is it the big one telling you you're being recorded?
Yes, it is.
All right, we did it. Hey, session 5, planning and community development. Tonight we are going to do some housekeeping, which is what I'm referring to that whole mess that we just went through as. Then we're going to hear from planning. There's going to be a break. Community development will come back, and there will be some time for aha moments. I will say that in terms of housekeeping updates, city offices are going to be closed this coming Monday, February 21st, in observance of President's Day. So if you come to City Hall and find the doors locked, that's why. Do we have other community updates? It's a pretty light forecast this month. Anybody else have community updates to share?
It is my wife's birthday, February 21st.
Well, very happy birthday to her.
Thank you. We're going to Manzanita.
Fantastic.
Good plan. You can say hi to the city's former community development director.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Layla Aman out there now. I will say, just as a little bit of housekeeping before we roll on past this, I received an event. Well, it wasn't even an event permit application. It was a notice of an event that's being planned by one of our community groups, and it doesn't really matter what the group was. I'm not here to cast any kind of aspersion or shade on that group. What I will say is that in that they made references to the city-county building, which would be, they meant to say City Hall. And what that suggests to me is that, and it could have been a typo, it was in a couple of places. Again, this isn't at them. But what that suggests to me is that some of even our most engaged residents are not totally spun up on the distinction between city government and county government and what those two levels of government do, let alone state or federal. I mean, I don't think that anybody's mistaking Milwaukee City Hall for the Capitol building, but my point is this: you folks who are here tonight have taken time out of your schedules and taken time away from your lives to come and learn about how it is that government functions. And I would just want to commend you all on that. It's entirely possible that I will someday send a letter referring to the city-county building, and that's okay. Because we all miss things from time to time, but the larger point is that you've taken an interest and you've gotten involved, and so from this public service professional to all of you, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, but Dan, those people may have come from either San Francisco or Miami. Either
that's true.
The city county.
That's
function.
true. Places where the city and the county are the same.
Yeah.
You know what? Stefan, walk a mile in somebody's shoes before you judge them. I think that's the lesson. All right, agreements. our agreements. We will show respect and empathy for each other and guests. We will seek to be actively involved in the class. We will allow the facilitators to be responsible for keeping the class on time and on track. And number 4, my very favorite, we will seek to make Milwaukee a flourishing city that is entirely equitable, delightfully livable, and completely sustainable. All right. So next up, we have planning. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Laura and Ryan.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. First, I think some of you met Ryan. Ryan Dyer, he's here tonight. He's my planning colleague in the planning department. He's fairly new to the city, so go easy on him. Then we've also got Joseph Brilio, who's here tonight, who's the community development director, and he's actually my boss, and he's going to be the second half of this presentation. So we've got good representation from the community development department. So, and thanks so much for having us here tonight. I always love talking about planning. So if I get a little wonky, somebody stop me and ask me a question, okay? And then also, just so you know, I am looking at 2 different screens. So if you see me looking off into the distance, I'm just looking at a different screen. So everybody just know that. I want you to know that I'm just trying to read everything at the same time. So anyway, enough said about that. We will move on, and I will tell you a little bit about what planning is all about. So Dan, if you want to go on to the next slide.
Sure. Laura, I think we may actually have a question for you already.
Okay.
Kevin, I see that you've got your hand up, but I'm not 100% sure. Would you like to type that in or speak, or what's comfortable for you? Oh, hands down. All right. Error. Very good. On we go.
Okay, great. So tonight we're going to cover what land use planning is, kind of the key concepts that will kind of give you an idea of the planning activities that we deal with in the city and the region and the state, and then how you can get involved with planning activities in Milwaukee. And so Dan, this is one of those little iterative PowerPoints. So you have to go boom. There you go. Okay. So those are the 3 things. So you can just click through them until you see what's on the screen. Okay, great. And so what is land use planning? It kind of refers to the processes, programs, and regulations that control what, where, and how development happens in Milwaukee. It includes overseeing the development process, looking at what buildings get built, where they get built, where new infrastructure is required to support what's getting built. Think about sewer, street, sidewalks. And then it also includes understanding how development impacts the lives and livelihood of people in the community. Good planning engages the public to establish a vision for the future, and when necessary, to change rules and policies and programs to move the community closer to that vision. Next slide. So we've got 2 different types of planning. We have long-range planning and we have current planning. And long-range planning is kind of the process of looking at our current conditions in the city, identifying the community that we want, and then developing strategies to get to that vision. And then current planning describes the application of regulations to new development proposals. And one way to think about current planning is kind of the implementation of the goals and policies identified through the long-range planning process. So we kind of set this vision of what we want the city to be at a very high level, and then we take it all the way down to kind of what can happen in on the lot that's right next to your house, or what happens in downtown. So it's a really long process from establishing a vision to get all the way down to the development code. And we're constantly kind of working on updating different plans that get us to that development code and get us new programs and plans that move us towards the vision. All right, so the next slide, please. So let's talk about long-range planning. Okay, so long-range planning is kind of unique in Oregon. We have a unique framework here in that we have a statewide planning program, which is unlike any other state really in the country. And then we also have a regional planning program through Metro, which Milwaukee is in the Metro region. So you can see that. Oh, sorry, Dan, if you could switch the slide? Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So you can see the Oregon State, and then you can see the outline of the metropolitan of the metro region, and then you can see the city of Milwaukee. And so we have the metro regional government, which includes everything from Milwaukee to Beaverton, all the way out to Hillsborough, to Portland, to Gresham, because we really, if you think about it, we function as a region. Milwaukee, we have people living here and working elsewhere, and working in Milwaukee and living elsewhere. So people are moving around the region a lot. So we do a lot of coordinating regionally for our land use and transportation planning. And then we also have our own city code and our own city plans for what we want to happen specifically in Milwaukee regarding our housing, regarding our transportation, our economic development. So throughout all of these, there's kind of rules and guidance from the state, and then from Metro, and then we have our own policies. So we are kind of multi-layered in the framework in which we are functioning in to do our planning. So it's really important because back in the Oregon, like I said, is unique in that back in the 60s and 70s, there was the real concern from Oregonians by looking actually at California and kind of seeing how California was sprawling out. And Oregonians made a decision collectively as a state. There was a lot of engagement, a lot of conversations throughout the whole state. And we decided that it was really important here that we wanted to protect our farm and forest lands. So we decided to create urban growth boundaries around metropolitan areas and around smaller areas so that you couldn't actually build outside our urban growth boundaries. I mean, you can build outside the urban growth boundaries, but the idea is that within the urban growth boundaries, it's a more dense, more compact type of development. And so that's what you see in the metro region. We are all within one urban growth boundary. And so if you go to the next slide, Dan, it talks a little bit about the statewide planning goals. So each community over a certain size in the state of Oregon needs to have these different planning goals. It's all the way from how we do citizen involvement to how we develop our parks and recreational areas, all the way to transportation. And then there are also a few other, if you hit the next button, Dan, you can see that there's the grayed out areas are things that we don't actually have in the city of Milwaukee. So we don't actually have to include these things in our planning process because we don't have any coast or beaches in Milwaukee, although that might be kind of nice. I could probably get into that idea. But if you go to the next one, so like I said before, we have urban growth boundaries. And so we are all required to plan for our urban growth boundary. And so that's what we do in the region. And Milwaukee is actually, there are a lot of jurisdictions in the metro urban growth boundary that actually border the urban growth boundary. So they can actually sometimes expand something. Sometimes the urban growth boundary gets expanded. But here in Milwaukee, we are surrounded by other jurisdictions. So what we have, the land that we have in Milwaukee is the only land that we'll have. Whereas say a community like Hillsborough, they live it's right on the edge of the urban growth boundary. So sometimes they can expand their boundary to accommodate their growth needs. But here in Milwaukee, we can't expand our boundaries. So we need to do infill within our existing boundaries. So, and that kind of is the goal of the urban growth boundary, is to make more compact, denser neighborhoods within the urban growth boundary so that we can all have a good transportation system, we can have good transit and denser neighborhoods within the urban growth boundary.
Hey, oh, sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead. Well, I was going to say, I know folks sometimes will ask about the shape of Milwaukee because it has kind of a, and Richard, you're reading my mind. He's saying annexing. You are, sometimes folks will ask about the shape of Milwaukee because we've got, particularly in the northeast part of the city, we've got kind of a checkerboard, or sometimes we'll say Swiss cheese in like the Nisi area up there. And then I know like on the south end with the addition of North Clackamas Park and Cherokee Farms, that we've got an island of unincorporated unincorporated Clackamas County that will probably eventually be Milwaukee inside the city there. Could you talk a little bit about, unless you've got annexation coming up later, but maybe like the urban growth management area and kind of what that means for the city?
Yeah, I don't actually have anything about annexation, which is a good question. It hasn't come up before. Annexation, so basically, like you alluded to, Dan, we share this border with Clackamas County. It's unincorporated Clackamas County. But what we also have is an agreement that we have an urban growth management area that eventually will come into the city. And so that area goes pretty far to the east. But we don't have an active annexation policy in the city. So we don't actively seek lands to come into the city. Basically, what happens is when people annex to the city of Milwaukee, it's usually because they have a failing septic system and they need to hook up to our sewer system. That's kind of the main reason folks will come in. Some folks come in because they just want to be part of the city of Milwaukee and they want to kind of work within the land use framework that we have, because our rules and regulations are a little bit different than Clackamas County's rules and regulations. So it kind of depends on what kind of city that you're looking to live in. If you look at Milwaukee, it's very different than those areas of unincorporated Clackamas County in some areas. And so and the thing is that there's a lot of service districts within the city of Milwaukee that serve the larger Clackamas County area. And so it's a complicated question, but if you live on that edge and you want to come into the city, we welcome you into the city and we will hook you up to sewer and you'll be part of the city of Milwaukee. But we don't actively ask people to annex into the city unless that's a unique situation.
Awesome. Thank you.
I hope that was I hope that was somewhat clear. All right.
So.
Okay. So then on to the next slide. So what we have is really planning starts with visioning. And we in the city of Milwaukee were lucky enough to do this process. We followed this process really closely over the last few years, and it really is fantastic because it gives us a clear vision of what the city is trying to be as we change over time. And so back in 2017, the city adopted a vision for the city, and they went through the city council that was led by the city council and went through a long process with the community to establish that vision of what we wanted to be in 2040. And actually it was funny, Dan, that you said that you wanted, at the beginning, you said you had a quote from the actual visioning about being a delightfully livable city. And so that is kind of the vision that is set forth, and it talks about what Milwaukee wants to be. And so in order to actually be able to implement that vision, we actually have to go into a comprehensive plan, which is guided by those statewide planning goals. And then we develop the goals and policies that can help us get to that vision. And so we just did that. There was several years of process that went through, lots of outreach and community engagement. And I know several of you, Stefan definitely was here through all of that. And that was adopted back in 2020. And so what we've been charged with at the moment is to start implementing all of those goals and policies in the comprehensive plan to help us realize the vision. And so what we have to do is we have to look at our zoning map and our zoning code to look at the regulations to implement the comprehensive plan and the vision. So Dan, if you'll go on to the next one. All right. Yep, I think we're going on to the zoning. Yeah, there you go. All right, so you might already be familiar with zoning. Zoning is kind of the process of dividing land into areas. Each of those areas have a set of rules that govern how the property can be used and how it can be developed. The collection of rules is referred to as the zoning code. Together, the map that you see here, and then the code regulate where different types of development can occur, how that development occurs, and how property can be used. So if you look at this map, this is the zoning map for Milwaukee, and all of the yellow is residential neighborhoods. Okay, so we have lots and lots of residential neighborhoods in Milwaukee. And then if you look at the red, you've kind of got the downtown mixed use. And then more the commercial is kind of those areas in between, with the purple and the orange, and then the blues are where the industrial area is. And so those designations in those areas kind of, they designate what can be built in those areas. And to a certain extent, they regulate the form of what actually gets built. But I'll get into that a little bit more. And like with any public policy tool, zoning can be used towards positive and negative ends. You might recall, like from the email that Dan sent out a few weeks ago, he referenced a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And this book illustrates how governments across the nation, both intentionally and unintentionally, have used seemingly benign characteristics of zoning codes to segregate people by race and class. And similarly, there's been a growing awareness since the 1980s that the complete separations of uses, residential, commercial, et cetera, frequently results in communities that are less active and more auto-dependent and less resilient economically and environmentally. So right now we're kind of going through and making changes to our zoning code that kind of go back and fix some of the mistakes that were made in the past. Planning is an imperfect science, and it's really based on kind of the vision of communities at the time that the plans are put in place. And so they evolve over time. And so now we're doing some work to kind of break down some of those barriers that we put in our zoning code before. And if you move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that, Dan. So right now, like I said, we did the vision, we did the comprehensive planning, and now we are down into starting to implement the comprehensive plan. And what we heard during the comprehensive planning process is that people wanted more flexibility to develop housing. We wanted to increase our tree canopy. We wanted some mixed use development. We wanted more transportation choices in the city. So goals and policies have been adopted. And over the past year, the city has been working to update its own zoning rules to better reflect that vision. And so in keeping what I mentioned about the statewide nature in Oregon, some of the changes proposed through this process are required by the state. Namely, all cities in Oregon are now required to allow for more flexibility in the types of housing that can be built in residentially zoned land. And cities must actively pursue strategies that address housing affordability. Fortunately for the city of Milwaukee, Milwaukeeans were already ahead of the state, the new state rules, and we had already started thinking about allowing different types of housing throughout all of our neighborhoods, thinking about managing our parking throughout the city, and then also thinking about increasing our tree canopy. And that's currently actually going through a process right now. We've been talking with the community for, gosh, I guess a year and a half now, just specifically about these three things. And we've been at the Planning Commission, and now we're at City Council going through all of these concepts that will ultimately be adopted into code. So if you move on to the next slide, Dan.
Laura, we did have a question about about the map.
Okay.
And this is from Kevin, who says, what is the story behind that little rectangle in the middle north of the city near Ardenwald School that is the city of Portland? It's in Clackamas County and south of Johnson Creek. And I know I've heard stories about that. I think a lot of us who have been around long enough have heard stories about that. But do you know, we've got kind of an irregular northern border there. Do you know the actual history of that?
You know, I don't, but I bet Stefan does. Does Stefan know the border?
Yeah.
This is anecdotal, but what I was told when I asked that question about 20 years ago was that there had been an important city of Portland official who lived in that area. I can't remember if he was a fire chief or a police chief or something like that. And so they made sure that the boundary included that property. Again, that's just what I was told. I have never verified that.
The version of that story that I heard was fire chief, and that's something a lot of cities, some cities, I don't know, I said a lot. Some cities will require that certain officials at a certain level live within the jurisdiction. It's not unusual, to Kevin's question, for there to be pieces of Portland that are in Clackamas County. There are a few areas like that, including over in the southwest and further out in the southeast. But yeah, it's a weird, kind of an unusual little peninsula. Hey, Laura, you had a presentation.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. All right, let's see.
Where are
Okay,
we
so
at?
yeah, it's the next slide. Thanks, Dan. So I've kind of given you an idea of kind of like this framework within which we've been working kind of based on the state and regional concepts. And then we do more things. We have more long range plans. There's always lots of long range plans going on in planning. So we can look back, and in 2018, and this is more actually community development, and Joseph's wheelhouse was the housing affordability strategy, to take a look at what the city could do to mitigate the well-known challenge of housing affordability. And then in 2020, there was the North Milwaukee Innovation Plan, which identified opportunities to retain and attract innovative businesses in North Milwaukee. And then beginning this summer, the city is going to begin the process of updating its transportation system plan. And the transportation system plan outlines projects, programs, and policies to meet the community's transportation needs now and in the future. And I'm going to be heading that up, and we're going to be kicking that off in the fall. And we will be looking for people to sit on our transportation steering committee or advisory committee, whatever we decide to name it. So we will let folks know when that happens, if people happen to have an interest in transportation planning. And so if you want to go to the next one, Dan. So then just a little bit more, some other examples of long range planning programs and plans that we've got out there. The city conducted a residential parking study last year to, well, gosh, it's been maybe a couple of years ago, to better understand parking supply and demand in our neighborhoods. Another parking study was conducted in 2018 to understand parking conditions in the downtown area. And then in 2020, realizing that there were 2 significant vacant properties in central Milwaukee that might be redeveloped, and that the central Milwaukee plays a big role in Milwaukee's transportation system plan by connecting a lot of neighborhoods of downtown and other commercial opportunities. The city conducted a study that focused on how those places could be redeveloped to establish a better connected bicycle and pedestrian network in the city. And then we've got the, right. So then we've got the there was the ADU waiver program, right? I was sorry, I was looking somewhere else. So the accessory dwelling units, if everyone knows what those are, they're little smaller units that you can have on your property that are called accessory, and you can rent them out to folks. And we're really trying to find more ways to incentivize smaller types of housing through the city that becomes, more affordable for folks. And so we had a pilot program to incentivize accessory dwelling units being built in the city, and that was really successful. And I think we had 10 that went through the program, and we've had more accessory dwelling units come through the pipeline since then. So if you see little houses in your neighbor's backyard, that's probably sometimes what those things are, is accessory dwelling units. All right, and so then on to the next slide, Dan. Okay, so what we covered, statewide planning goals. You can keep going, Dan, keep going. Okay, that's okay, there you go. Planning goals, urban growth boundary, visioning, comprehensive planning process, zoning maps and codes. And then before I go into the current planning conversation, I just wanted to take a pause and see if there were any more questions regarding the big long range context within which we plan in the city of Milwaukee. All right, all right. There's going to be a quiz later, you all. Just telling you. No, not really. I would never do that to you. It's taken me years to figure it out, so I would never ask it of you. All right, so on to the next one, Dan.
Laura, can I jump in just for a second?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think your presentation's been great up to this point, but I want to point out, when you were talking about the function of the statewide planning program, and you talked about what you see as the advantages of urban life. But as somebody who came to Oregon in the mid-70s deliberately to work on this, I have to say that was about protecting farm and forest land from urbanization. So it was, no other states had done it at that point, and it was draw a line on the map and say, you cities, go ahead and build out in there. But out here, this is farm and forest land, and it is to be protected. And that's what we were working on for all those years. So anyway.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stefan. Maybe that's so ingrained in my mind that I didn't actually say it out loud. So I appreciate you saying that out loud for me. And I think it's really interesting if anybody has the opportunity to kind of drive out to where you can find the line of the urban growth boundary, because you will see development right up to that line. And then you see farms and fields right on the other side of the street. So it's really stark and you can see it in the built environment. It's really impressive that we've been able to do that here in the city.
And it's unlike anything else that I've seen in other states.
Yep. I don't think anybody, and no one else, it's not, I don't think nobody else does it the way we do it here in Oregon. So it's a really unique system. And I really thank our friends and family in the 1970s for setting this course for us, because it's kind of been a game changer in maintaining a lot of that rural area that we also love so much. And so thank you. And thank you, Stefan, for being there at the time and leading the charge or being in the charge. All right. Okay. So then we go. Yep. Go ahead, Dan.
We do have a question in the chat regarding annexation. This is from Sarah. Regarding annexation, can you please clarify how communities approach the city regarding annexation? Is this done on a neighborhood basis or by individual property owners?
Right now, it is done by individual property owners. Like I said, the city does not have an active annexation policy. So generally, people will ask to annex to the city.
Sarah, did you have, and please feel free to unmute if you'd like to, but anything? Wow, thanks. Okay, so I think that's probably a no. And Laura, as you were.
Okay, cool. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of current planning. Okay, so remember, current planning is where we apply the adopted regulations to individual development proposals. In a sense, it's kind of the implementation of the goals and policies identified in the long-range planning process that we just talked about. So through the current planning process, the city ensures that the use that's being proposed is consistent with the zoning code. So for example, if you're wanting to build an industrial building in a residential zone, that's not going to work because you can only build residential in residential zones. So we kind of regulate where things get built. And then you have to ensure that the physical structure that's being built is consistent with the development and design standards in the zoning code. And I'll show you an example of that the appropriate city services are being provided to service that use, and that the impacts to the surrounding properties are mitigated in a reasonable fashion. Because the idea is that we're kind of all trying to live within a community in a symbiotic fashion. And so we try to make sure that things that are next to one another are compatible with one another through our zoning code. Okay, so the next one. So we'll just give a little example. Dan, if you want to, yep, okay. So let's talk just for a few minutes about development that is allowed by right. Meaning that land use review isn't required if the design and development standards can be met. And so one of these examples, there's many examples of this, but one of these examples would be a triplex. And right now, well, I won't get into the complicated nature of how our code is changing right before our very eyes right now as we speak. But so say somebody wants to build a triplex. So what they would do is they would go in and look at the zoning map to see what the property is zoned. And then they would check the zoning code to determine if a triplex is an allowed use in that zone. So currently like say for a triplex, triplexes aren't allowed throughout all the residential zones in the city right at the very moment, but they will be allowed in almost all the residential zones by the June 30th of 2022. So codes are changing right now. But if we just stick with this, so let's stick with the triplex. So then let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, there we go. So got these fancy slides. So assuming that the louse is used and the applicant has designed the triplex. She's got the drawings in her hands. So the next step is she goes in to submit for building permits. And when she submits for the building permits, multiple city departments are involved in reviewing that proposal, looking at those drawings, making sure that those drawings are consistent with our own code, right? So the building department works to ensure that structures are compliant with the state's residential building codes. Think structural integrity, fire safety, energy efficiency. And then engineering works to make sure that all the city utilities, including wastewater, drinking water, street stormwater infrastructure, meet the city requirements. And then planning works to ensure that the proposal complies with all the allowed uses, along with the design and development standards. Next, please. So design standards deal with how the built environment looks, how it feels, and how it functions within a broader context. Planners have long understood that design isn't simply about the aesthetics, but that the built environment also informs how we experience a place and how that can influence behavior. And so Milwaukee's code kind of seeks to create visual appeal that's not too prescriptive, because you want people to be able to build houses that they want to build. But there are some requirements, so that the experience of the person on the street is not a negative one. So such as we including windows on the front of the triplex, so it's like eyes on the street, and then you have a menu of other things from which folks can choose. So you can put in a dormer, you can put a recessed entryway, you can have roof eaves or window trim. So you get a number of options. So those are design standards. And then next, you have to look at the development standard. So Dan, if you want to go on to that one. So development standards also have an aesthetic quality, but they address how the structure relates to the lot and to the surrounding properties. For example, Milwaukee's development standards regulate how much of a property has to be vegetated, how far the setback is from the structure, from the property line, how far the structure is set back from the property line. So you need to have some space in between your neighbors, you need to have some space from the street, and then you have setbacks for backyards. And then also we have things like building heights. So collectively, we're kind of want the form to fit into the environment within which it's going to live. And so it's interesting, we've got this new code that's coming along that's going to be allowing duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes and townhomes and cottage clusters in a lot of areas that used to only allow single unit houses. So what we've done is we've kept the same design standards in place for a single unit as we would require you to have for 4 units. So the building can only still be as tall as a single unit house if you have a 4-plex. And you can only have as much lot coverage in most cases for a single family home as you can for a duplex or quadplex. And so the idea is that even though you're getting more density throughout the city, it will look very similar to the density that already exists in the city, with the exception of a few different types that are now going to be allowed, which are townhomes, which they've been allowed in the city for a long time, but very few of them have been built. And then there's also cottage clusters that are going to be allowed throughout the city, which I think is a really interesting and unique way to build smaller houses on some larger lots. All right, Dan, I think we're on to the next one. Okay.
Fancy.
Yep, go ahead, Dan, sorry.
Is there more? Oh, I just said fancy.
Oh, yes, very fancy. See, Ryan has built all these fancy slides for me. So this is the first time we've been through them. So this is great. So the land use review. So like we were talking about, the triplex is something that's allowed by right, okay? But a lot of other things are not allowed by right. It requires a level of review, different levels of review. So for instance, how many of you are familiar with kind of the Axle Tree building in downtown? So maybe a few people. Okay, so kind of Axle Tree is a big development that went in downtown. And so it couldn't just, it's not allowed by right. They just can't come in and get building permits and start building their building. They have to go through a pretty rigid design process and review process in order to be allowed to build what they built. So that's what this is all about. It's kind of talking about the review type dictates who makes the decision, how much time is required to process the application, who gets notified about the development, whether a public hearing is required, and how much discretion the decision maker has. And so let's see, why don't we go on to the next slide? So beyond there's this way that we review land use proposals that is based on kind of the level of complexity that is required. There's also criteria and standards that are in the land use decision. And sometimes the criteria are subjective, other times they're more straightforward. The criteria for any land use decision and the applicant evidence, we have to write it all up in a staff report, and then we review it and it's evidence of fact. And then if it's appropriate, the land use decision might include conditions of approval or actions that the applicant must take for the approval to remain in effect. And sometimes it will get through all the approval process, whether it's somebody, me, I can review some things, but then others have to be approved by the Planning Commission, and then others end up being approved by the Planning Commission and the City Council. And even if it gets approved all the way to the City Council, someone can still appeal that decision and take it all the way to the state to look at. Unfortunately, we haven't had that happen very often in the city of Milwaukee. None in the years that I've been here, and for years past in a short term. So that's good, which means that the process here in the city is working. All right, and so then Dan, yeah, go ahead.
Laura, we do have a question in the chat. Can you explain what a cottage cluster is?
Yeah, and I wish I had a good picture, which I don't. But let's say you have a big lot. Let's say you've got a 20,000 square foot lot, and you've got a single family house on that lot. Now what you can do is you can build what's known as a cluster of small homes. So the footprint can't be bigger than 900 feet, which means that the actual footprint itself can be 900 feet, but then it can be up to 1,500 square feet because you can go up a story. So you can build a series of, say, we'll just say 10 for our purposes here. You would build 10 little cottages, and they would need to be oriented around open space on the lot. And then all of the parking would not actually go as a one-to-one with each cottage. You could put the parking in one area. So you would have a shared parking area. So it's kind of this way. And if I'll send out a couple of slides because I can show you some really good pictures of what these might look like. There's a couple of great ones that have been built in the city of Portland. We've had the cottage clusters standards here in the city of Milwaukee for years, but they were really stringent. So we didn't get any cottage clusters built, but now we've gone in to tweak our cottage clusters standards. So we're really hoping that we will get some built, and we do think that we will. We've had some people coming in asking to learn more about that and trying to see what might work on a lot. So the idea is smaller houses that are hopefully more affordable with a shared common areas. So they gather into open space, so they share open space, and then they have all of their parking maybe in one or two places. Does that kind of give you a decent idea of what a cottage cluster development is?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, good. And I'll send out some photos and slides to Dan so you can get a nice visual reference of that.
And then with that, Laura, there is one other question that came in, which is from Arlene, which is, Laura, did you say there are codes for maximum amounts of coverage rather than minimum standards?
There are codes for maximum amounts of coverage, lot coverage. Yes.
So if I
There
have
are
a,
then minimum standards too for you. So you can only cover a certain amount of a lot with certain structures, but then you also have another standard where you have to have a minimum of 30% vegetation on your lot. So it's a combination of minimum and maximums to try to get to something that is compatible with the rest of the neighborhood.
and the idea there being that there is some balance, not equal balance, but some kind of balance between the buildings that are on a given property and the amount of vegetation or just non-built land.
Yes, because I mean, we really value trees in Milwaukee. We obviously it's really good for climate change. It's good for stormwater. It's good for trees, and landscaping are so good. You don't want to have a lot of pavement and all of everything built over, because then you get urban heat island effects. And we know that during kind of the climate change and the massive, what did they call it? The heat dome last year, the places that were completely covered in pavement had its much higher temperatures than areas that were not covered in pavement. So the idea is that here in Milwaukee, we would like to kind of maintain that balance between the built environment and the natural environment to try to strike that right balance.
Thank you.
Yep.
Next, do you say next slide?
Sure.
so.
Let's go on to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. So next, Okay. So we've looked at land use review, the building permitting process, design standards, development standards. Okay, next one. And so now it's like, how can you get engaged here in the city of Milwaukee with planning and in lots of other ways as well. But one thing is that the best thing, and this is a recent tool that the city has put out, is the Engage Milwaukee engagement tool. And it's a website that the city uses to gather all kinds of feedback and answer questions on long range projects and also lots of other projects in the city. So if you go to Engage Milwaukee and you sign up, you can get descriptions of all kinds of different projects that are going on in the city. And then if they're active projects, there'll be surveys and feedback loops. And so it's really a great way for folks to kind of be in the know of what is actively occurring at the city and at the time, and then share your feedback and your thoughts on what's going on. And that's through the Engage Milwaukee website. And then the next one is if you want to look specifically at development applications, if you want to find out what's going on in your neighborhood, actually you can literally find out what's going on in your neighborhood if you look at this slide. So these are the active development proposals that are happening throughout the city. And if you look all the way to the right, it says NDA, and it tells you which NDA that project is in. So then you can click on the information. You can see the staff report, and you can see exactly what is happening and where it is in the development review process. And in some cases, there are opportunities for the public to get involved and provide feedback. So check those out. That's a really useful tool at the city. And then also, you'll see notices of public hearings. And so if there is a public hearing that's happening, that's something that's happening in your neighborhood, there will be notices, and you can learn about the location and where to send in comments. And you can learn about that also through the previous page on the web that I was just telling you about. And then let's see. Oh, current development proposals. I think we kind of already went through that. And so then I will go to the next one. Oh, yes, of course. So then also you can always testify at Planning Commission, at City Council. And so I would encourage you all, if you haven't been to a Planning Commission meeting or if you haven't been to a City Council meeting, you should go and check those out. That's a really interesting to learn about how the city kind of Planning Commission in particular reviews development proposals, and sometimes those proposals get to the city council, but then the city council reviews kind of code amendments, and all the city council reviews all kinds of things. And so they're setting the policy. So if there's something that you're particularly interested in, you could attend a city council meeting where they're talking about that. And so then the next slide, again, it just kind of goes over a few of the things, a few of the pages that you can check out. So where Engage Milwaukee is. our municipal code, which talks about all that zoning stuff that I talked about, where you can build, what you can build where and how it can be built. You can find out all the details. It's all online. And then again, there's the zoning map, and then the planning department web pages. There's lots of information about planning on those pages. I encourage you to check it out. And then also, if you ever have any questions, we have a planner on duty every day. And so anything that comes in specifically related to planning questions, they're happy to talk to you. And then also, if you have any questions about kind of the larger way things work in the city, I am always happy to talk to you as well about that. So I don't know if anybody has any questions before I hand it over to my boss, Joseph.
It looks like you got a question from Morgan. I just
Yeah.
want to, sorry, Dan, I saw that question in the chat box.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Joseph, please.
Kevin, a question about the Milwaukee marketplace and the grocery store. I wish I knew that we literally have reached out to the brokers who have solidified the leasing deal, and they are tight-lipped about these things. We won't find out. They don't want to know they don't want their competitors to know who they are and who's locating next to them. So they're tight-lipped. We won't find out for sure until they submit tenant improvement plans for the interior or even a sign permit. So that's would love to share good news, but it's exciting, but we'll see, I guess is the short of it.
That's an answer, Joseph. I know that you've and Morgan, I see you. We'll get you. That's an answer that I know you've given before, because that's the true answer. That's where we're at. But that's pretty standard for folks who might not know when a retailer is moving into a space like that for the city or other local jurisdiction, to not really find out specifically who that is for a while. Got some nodding there.
Yeah, it is. They don't want to. They won't share with the city because they know we're a public entity, and we have different rules. So when someone asks, we have to tell. So they will not tell us until they absolutely have to. At the very end.
Thank you, Morgan.
I don't know exactly what my question is, but there's sort of some juxtaposition between wanting to increase density, but then the people who already live there, I think there's a tendency to want to keep density low and keep them single family homes. I think people believe that will keep their property value the highest, scarcity maybe. So I guess I just wanted to know your thoughts on that. If you guys have bumped into that, as denser projects have come up, and pushback from the neighbors. Yeah.
I could say that for some of the denser projects in the downtown, I think that those are good places to put those denser projects because they're not out in the single family or the single unit neighborhoods. Right now, what we're trying to do is increase density in those neighborhoods while still having the same form of housing. So you're not going to see a 4-story building come up in a single unit neighborhood. You're going to see the same heights that are allowed now in your neighborhood continue to be allowed. So what we're really trying to do is to make sure that the new density that comes in kind of feels and looks a little bit like the density that's already there. So it's really about, we're trying to focus on the form, understanding that people do have these concerns, but that a duplex or a triplex or even a fourplex can sometimes fit right into a neighborhood and not look much different or not be a lot bigger than some of the biggest single family homes that you'll see. Because we are, if you look around, a lot of the new houses are actually quite large, and that actually fills our development codes now. You can build houses that are that large, but you can also, so now you'll just be able to build a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex, but it can't be any larger in most cases than those homes that you're seeing built now. So we're trying to respect that there is a scarcity of land, and so we need to infill on the land that we have within the urban growth boundaries, so we can keep those rural areas that we all love pristine and keep them that. So that means that we have to build inside the city. So we're trying to be smart about how we're doing it, kind of because we know that livability is really important to communities. And so we're trying to maintain that.
Great, thank you.
Laura, I didn't hear you mention it. You may have, but I didn't hear you mention House Bill 2001, which is obviously a huge factor in a lot of this that people just probably don't even know about in general.
Yeah, and part of that is, well, so when I was talking about the work that's going on right now in the city, where we're looking at adding duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, that is being directed by the state and is required throughout many of the communities in the state. City of Milwaukee was already kind of heading in that direction anyway through the comp plan policies, because folks in Milwaukee recognize that we need more housing options for different people with different needs, because we have a lot of single family housing. And the idea is that we need to have more choices for people with different wants, different desires, and different income levels. And so we were heading in that direction with our comprehensive plan policies, and then House Bill 2001 came along and said, well, you have to do that. And not only do you have to do it, Milwaukee, Portland has to do it, Lake Oswego has to do it, Bend has to do it, Eugene has to do it. So there, it's like I was talking about in that slide where it talks about the state, talks about Metro and Milwaukee. A lot of things are coming out of the state right now that are impacting all of Oregon.
Molly, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, can you hear
Hi.
me? So going back to this mystery grocery retailer, so exciting. We don't, and this might be a stupid question, we don't have any say, like what businesses come in or anything like that. Like the city doesn't they don't ever get to know. Like it could just be another Dollar Tree. Does it have to be a grocery store because it's zoned for a grocery store? Is that how we know it's a grocery store? Like how is that controlled within this context?
I think that there's allowed uses just in general zones, right? So in certain areas you can have certain kinds of businesses. It could be a Dollar General store, it could be a grocery store, it could be a hair salon, it could be, in some cases you can have a car dealership, but certain areas of the city are zoned for certain types of uses, and we can't tell people what specifically has to go into a space. As long as it fits in that category of uses that we've identified as the kind of businesses we want in that area, then those businesses can come in.
Thank you.
That's something too. We get that question a lot in the city manager's office. Folks will say, I want there to be a grocery store downtown, or there should be. Grocery stores are a hot topic, but I mean, it's questions like that. And the thing is, you can make an area, you can zone an area for something, you can make an area appealing to a certain vendor, but to a certain kind of vendor, but ultimately the city doesn't put a grocery store in somewhere. The city doesn't put, the city puts a police station in somewhere. The cities that manage their own fire department put a fire station in. Cities with their school districts, now in this area, North Clackamas School District puts a school in somewhere. But those are government services. Private businesses are on their own largely. And Joseph, I'm sure, will say more about that in his presentation next hour. We've got about 3 minutes left. I see that Arlene and Emily have their hands up. I think, Arlene, that you were first. If you'd like to go, and then we'll try to get to Emily before break. Arlene, I think you're muted.
Just a quick comment. When I can't remember when this was or how long ago it was, but there was a community that didn't want X retailer, X grocery store to come in. And the process was the citizens banding together and making it known that they didn't want the grocery store. And it can't be achieved through planning or codes, obviously, because you can't tell a brand name grocery store that they can't come in. But that would take individual citizen action.
Mhm.
That's comment.
Thanks for that, Arlene. Emily, question to round out our planning presentation?
Actually, Arlene's comment kind of covered it, so I think I'm good. But
There you go.
yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. Goodness sake, wow. We will be back, there it was, in about 10 minutes. Let's come back together at 7:10 and we will pick up with community development. Thanks, everybody.
Good
Thanks
job,
for
Laura.
having me, everybody.
Laura.
Appreciate it. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Laura.
Bye.
Hey, Ryan, I need you to help me with my slide deck next time. You did a great job. Mine's so lame. Good job, Laura.
And I am going to share my screen as we hand it over to community development. Where did it go? There we go.
Where's the guitar?
We're doing it. Where's the guitars? Thank you for that vote of confidence. All righty.
Thanks, Dan. So for those that don't know me, I am Joseph Brulio. I'm the Community Development Director. I am 3 months in on the job. I'm still here. I probably know less than most people on this call. So I will try to do my best to impress and keep you awake in the next 30 or so minutes. Thank you, Dan. And also, I kind of want to echo what Dan said at the very beginning. Just hats off to you folks coming out here and actually investing in yourself to learn about your local government and about your community. I will say that's the hard work. It's really easy to be a skeptic these days, especially when it comes to government of all kinds. It's really easy to just regurgitate talking heads and such. So thank you for actually taking the time to get to know us as people and vice versa. And also a little bit about what happens at City Hall. So seriously, I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for being here and giving me the shot to speak to you. So tonight I'm gonna just quick overview. That's what I'll be speaking to. Those things on the left. So community development encompasses a number of things. It's not just planning. It's probably best known for planning and zoning, as well as building. Those are kind of the building department, which issues building permits. It also has economic development, housing. It also is the public development arm of the city. So any land the city owns and wants to develop, we become the project managers of those lands and create private-public partnerships. And I put admin on there just because we are coordinating with every other department as part of the city in order to get just about everything and anything done. So go ahead and jump right in. I mentioned, yeah, you can go to the next slide, Dan. Regulatory side of things. Laura did a great job, outstanding job, talking about the planning development code and such. I just wanted to mention that nothing happens without some purpose. You know, everything you see out there in the city of Milwaukee was on purpose for the most part. As what that means is that it's a manifestation of the development code of that time and era. Obviously, the development code has changed over the years, but it is all on purpose. So as we move forward in our development code and make amendments and changes, the city has sometimes added things called incentives. And that's like one way of producing what you want to see by providing a carrot to a developer or a property owner. And I just wanted to throw out a few of the incentives that the city uses to get kind of what it values. So the city values climate change, not it happening, but actually combating climate change. And so one of those things that the city has done is when like a hotel or a lodging use comes, or residential mixed use development actually provides a green building component and actually is certified in one of those that are shown up on the screen, the city actually incentivizes that by saying, okay, you can add a story to that, which allows more density, which allows more potentially leasable property. So it incentivizes them to do good. And for the most part, generally speaking, in my experience, 3 months on the job, the city is more of a carrot driven than a regulatory punishing driven city. Meaning we like to incentivize people to do good rather than just make them use sticks, so to speak. So an example of a stick to get somebody to do what you want them to do is usually in the development process, there's conditions of approval. So it's like basically saying developer, you must build this sidewalk in order to have your project. It's a common form of something that you have to do, as well as citations when someone does something wrong. So we have a whole code enforcement team that goes out and basically tells people, sorry, you didn't do that. Your neighbor told on you, and here's a citation. So moving on from that, we'll jump in. I just wanted to give kind of a broad brush stroke of the regulatory side. Next slide. So tonight I'm going to jump into a little bit more about incentives and how we use carrots to achieve desired outcomes. The city has a few interesting economic development tools in its tool belt that you may or may not be aware of. So I'll just touch on those briefly. They're on the left side, but I'll go into more detail with each. I'm going to actually try to go a little fast in my presentation because I'd actually rather have questions, conversation at the end. So if I'm going too fast, you let me know. But I also know that it's 7:15-ish, 7:17, and we only have so much time. So go forward, Dan, please. Okay, so there's a program that we offer called the Vertical Housing Tax Abatement Program. And the point of this program is to incentivize mixed use development. So I should say vertical mixed use. So think mixed use as two or more uses being residential and commercial or industrial or anything else. So this incentivizes vertical mixed use, so stacking them vertically. Commercial on the bottom, residential on the top in certain areas of the city. So it's basically provides a 10-year property tax exemption up to 80% of the improvements. And there's additional exemptions if the developer provides affordable housing as a part of that. But it incentivizes and pushes developers to do this type of development in the areas in which are mapped out for the city. And so the city allows for this type of program to occur in the downtown and in and around Milwaukie Marketplace. So that's where the city would like to see these types of developments and therefore incentivizes these types of developments. You can go on the next slide. Another kind of a newer incentive that the city is using is called the nonprofit low-income housing tax exemption. Nothing more boring than talking about tax abatements and exemptions, but I'm telling you, these are big ticket items for folks. This is actually a really cool one. Walsh Commons, which is owned by Northwest Housing Authority. It's 100% affordable housing development on Lake Road. They requested, this is a state program that any city can pick up if it wants to. The council is okay with it, and then we can get 51% of the other taxing districts to agree. So in Milwaukee, that's essentially, you just need the city of Milwaukee and the school district to agree to be okay with any kind of development that comes on that's 100% affordable housing and owned by a nonprofit. Basically to say, we will waive your property taxes for its annual renewal. So up to as long as it makes sense. So sometimes it might not make sense for a city or taxing district to continue to waive property taxes because they actually might need those property taxes. But we are doing it on this property, and it's been, I think, 3 years in the running, and it can go on in perpetuity, but it usually is connected to as long as all these units here are income restricted. So they are restricted to certain types of incomes and supporting people that actually really need housing. Okay, next slide. And you know what, actually ask you guys a question. Anybody know like the general rule for what is the definition of affordable housing? Like when that is thrown around, does anyone know what affordable housing even means typically when someone says it? Anybody? No? All right. So just so I'm guessing some of you actually know this. So affordable housing, a common definition of what is actually affordable is you are paying or using 30% of your household income to pay for housing. So let's say that your household makes 100 grand. That would be great. And you're paying $30,000 a year to your housing or mortgage or your rent. That would be affordable. That's a common definition that people use. And obviously we live in times right now where people are paying 50% and higher for their housing. So obviously not affordable. So income restricted helps regulate that.
And Joseph, real quick, is that different than subsidized housing?
No, not really. In most cases, those are commonly interchanged. So
Okay.
income restricted is usually subsidized by the Fed or by the county of some sort.
Great.
That's typically, yeah, they're usually regulated. Any other questions before we go on to enterprise zones? Cool. Next slide, Dan. This is enterprise zones is another program that incentivizes property development, but in this case, it's for commercial uses. So those yellow bands across the city limits, those are areas where if industrial use or commercial use was willing to, there's a number of criteria that go along with employment, but also just making sure they don't, that they maintain a certain amount of employment standards throughout their 3 or 5 years, then they can receive tax abatements, property tax relief from the county and state. And so we participate in that program. We've had an enterprise zone for quite a few years here in Milwaukee, but as you can see, it's mostly covering North Industrial Milwaukee area, downtown, and all along the Highway 224 area. Free to move forward. Urban renewal. This is kind of a huge deal. It's new to the city, and the fact that it was passed. And Dan, you probably remember, I think it's 2016 or 2017, the city passed urban renewal plan.
I think that it was 2017, but I wouldn't testify to that.
All right, I'm going with 2017. Dan says close enough. I think he's right. For those that don't know, this is going to get into some tax increment financing. I'll try to make it somewhat interesting so you can get it. But if you look at that map on the right, the city in 2017 mapped out an area that covers, again, kind of similar to the vertical housing tax abatement area, as well as the enterprise zone. They kind of overlap quite a bit. You can see on the left is kind of downtown and then the North Industrial area. And then to the east, you can see along Milwaukee Marketplace and Highway 224. So that's the geography. So an urban renewal allows the city to essentially designate these areas as needing additional resources for development. So it allows the city to capture taxes in these areas and use them for things like infrastructure development, so bike and ped improvements, road improvements in general, utility improvements. There it goes with the old adage that private dollars follow public investment. So the idea is that all these dollars generated in this area, I'll show you in a second how they're generated. They go back to these areas specifically to increase the public investment dollars and beautify their storefront programs to help businesses improve their storefront programs like downtown specifically. And again, to create different types of improvements all over the place in order to make it more attractive for private investment dollars. I will say that there has been, and rightfully so, some heat given to urban renewal over the years. This has been a tool, as Laura kind of mentioned, planning has been a tool to segregate folks. Urban renewal has also been used to essentially disenfranchise and intentionally displace and gentrify historic places of historic communities of color and sorts. It's got not a perfect history, I should say. So I just want to throw it out there because I think it's important to understand that it's not always used for good, but we are trying our darndest to do it for good here. You can move on to the next slide.
I will do that. I just want to say for folks who are not super into tax increment financing, this is first I've made the slides just as bright as possible, and I did that to make them a little bit more visible. Joseph, sorry to have butchered some of your work here, but some of the text was blending into the background. Also, I would say before we get into this is a little bit dry, and I'm sure Joseph's going to do a great job on it. No questions. You're going to say, Dan, what do you mean dry? That was fantastic. but just in case, I will say before we go into it, this is super, it's important stuff for how cities get built and how cities develop. So check it out, and if you take away a good understanding from it, I will tell you, I went through my MPA program and I didn't understand it, and then I did understand it after Layla Aman, who we mentioned earlier, our community development director last year, went through this presentation. So now that I've really set up expectations, here is the banana cream tax increment financing slide.
I think that was a good commercial. I don't know.
We'll see. Hey, here's this. Look at that. Wow.
Oh,
Look at
wow.
that. Look at all that color.
All right. So tax increment financing. So this is how urban renewal areas capture money. So if you look at this graph real quick, I'm trying to make this as simple as possible, so it's easy as possible. The gray graph is essentially what a property tax payer pays over 30 years. So every year your property taxes go up around no more than 3%, usually, unless you're doing a lot of development there. But it goes like that over time, right? It goes up and up and up. I wish it wouldn't, but it does. And so if you move to the next slide, as taxes just continue to do that over their age. Oh man, Dan, that's rough. I can't really see it. You can't really see it. There you go. So if the gray, and there's a dark gray. So the light gray is essentially the taxes that continue to go on. So the property owner is going to continue paying the exact same thing they would normally pay. Nothing's going to change for them. It's no increased taxing. They're just paying like they normally would. The dark gray is what's called a frozen base. So the city and county work together to basically say, we are going to freeze the tax base at this, when the urban renewal area is created. So in year 1, and all those taxes stay the same for all the taxing districts. So over the next 20 to 30 years, all the taxing districts, so fire, police, city, schools aren't really a part of this. And any other taxing district, I don't know, county, they will all get the same, or that dark purple, for the next however many years the life of the urban renewal. So they don't really lose anything. They're not really gaining anything. They're not following inflation or any kind of increase. They just kind of get this set amount for many years to come. You can go to the next slide, Dan.
I do want to say, in my defense, as rough as that is, it was harder on dark blue. So
hey, you're the pro.
Hey, look, it's visible. It's visible again. It's great.
Wait. All right, I can work with this. And so the frozen base stays the same, and everything above that frozen base is what we call the increment. And that is what all goes to the urban renewal agency, or the urban renewal area. So the city is going to be capturing that over the next close to 30 years. And everyone else will continue to pay the taxes as usual. Taxing districts will continue to get the same tax over that period. In some cities, basically, they either will, they'll either wait and accrue that increment and kind of build it up in their bank accounts, and then they'll fund projects with that, or they'll take out debt based on that forecast, if that makes sense. So some will take out debt and say we'll be able to pay it off in several years because of the urban renewal. So that's essentially tax increment financing. I'm sure I butchered it. I tried to, it's pretty dry, but I'm happy to answer questions. The next slide is probably a little bit easier there you go. Let's go to the next slide too. Dan, if you still have that, great. It's just a larger version. So those yellow is basically saying, those yellow bars are essentially when the urban renewal district is no longer needed and everything goes back to usual. So all the taxing districts receive that. The increment is no longer there, and they receive the higher amount over the next year. So again, this is not a tax on the property owners themselves. I think that's important to take away. This is something that a property owner wouldn't really even know is occurring. It's really the taxing districts that take the hit, so to speak.
So Joseph, I wanted to jump in here just for a second and say
Please,
that
help me, save me.
Actually, that's a good explanation, and I tried for about 30 years to explain it and never seemed to come up with a way to do it. And this graph helps a lot. But the thing that I wanted to stress for people who might not otherwise know it is that the city has to have an adopted plan for what that money is going to go for in the urban renewal area. It's not like, oh, now we've got a bunch more money, let's do something, let's hire an assistant community development director. I mean, it's for prescribed purposes anyway. And I've always thought of urban renewal in Oregon, at least, as a public-private partnership.
That's excellent. That's really, really good. Thanks for saying that. Actually, it also kind of teased me up because we're in the draft form of a 5-year action plan. So there are a bunch of projects outlined, as Stefan was saying, for the city to pursue over the next 5 years with the funds created so far. And that's things like, again, bike ped improvements, storefront facade grants, and business support, and extending utilities and infrastructure in those areas.
We do have a question in the chat, Joseph, from Richard. Don't those who benefit then move on to a new exempt location and leave empty places behind?
Hope not. There is definitely the potential. I mean, people could certainly benefit. So property owners could certainly benefit from the public, from the public entity like the city improving the area around them. It definitely will create a higher value. And that's the point, is we want the city, by creating better improvements around areas, will hopefully drive up property prices and make it more attractive for other private dollars. So if someone does want to leave, hopefully someone else would pick up where that person left off and actually want to invest because the city is actually improving the area. So I don't know. I actually don't know how to answer that question, just because the market is also a little bit tricky to figure out. Sometimes property owners do like to sit on properties because they don't really, I've seen it many times. It's even in many downtowns, they'll sit on properties because they've owned them for so long, they aren't paying that much on property taxes, and they don't really need the money from a leasee or somebody, or they don't, until they get exactly what they want, they'll just sit on it. So it's all about personality too, in a person's portfolio and what they're willing to take a risk on, what they care and don't care about. So it's a little bit more of a complicated answer, I think, maybe nuanced. Hopefully that helps a little bit though. Any other questions? No? Okay. So talked a little bit about vertical housing and enterprise zones. This is just kind of a quick view of some of the overlays we have in the city that kind of cover like where the downtown is, where overlay zones are, where the enterprise zones and vertical housing zones are, etc. You can move right through this one. Something that is really unique to the city is the construction excise tax. And this was passed in 2017. I can say about 10 or 11 other cities in Oregon have this, but essentially it levies a 1% tax on any residential or commercial construction that's over 100 grand. Anything above 100 grand, 1% is taken. And it's meant to be used, and it's dedicated. Actually, it's in our code. It's dedicated to affordable housing. So either supporting affordable housing development from like for a third party, or it's the city creating its own, developing its own housing. It's also supposed to support workforce housing, which is, in my view, also part of the affordable housing spectrum. You can see it's between 80 and 120% of the median family income is kind of what those funds are supposed to be dedicated in supporting. Any affordable housing project that is developing is exempt from getting a construction excise tax placed on them. And the good of it is again, develop new income restricted units, serve populations with financial need. And another part of it is supporting local businesses. There's an economic development piece. And case in point, the city used about 137,000 of it. And it's not a huge fund. It really is not a large fund, but during COVID, we supported the business community all over the city, had about 41 grants that we gave businesses to support them keep the lights on during COVID, especially when they're having a hard time at the very beginning. So those are just a quick So that's the construction excise tax, otherwise known as CET.
We've got a little bit of a longer question from Sarah. Sarah, I'm happy to read it unless you would like to. All right. So we have feel free. All right. You mentioned early in the presentation the low income housing tax exemption, which sounds like an amazing tool. But is it possible that an unintended consequence of this kind of tax exemption could be reducing the tax base in low income communities and thereby reducing available services or benefits those taxes would pay for?
Yeah, that's a good question. Excellent concern. I would say no, not really is the answer, because that program is specific to the affordable housing, the property that is owned by the nonprofit that runs income restricted housing. And so none of the services surrounding it are affected as far as streets and pedestrian walkways and any other services. Those don't change. It's just really what the property owner has to pay back to the county and city and other taxing districts. They won't have to have that additional funds. So part of that program is that those savings that the owner of those property that is regulating that property, that they will actually reinvest that saved money back into their tenants and back into their property. And whether it's through additional services, supportive housing services, or other amenities on site. So that's the intent.
This comes back to the notion, if I'm following you, Joseph, that if I'm a property owner in Milwaukee, I'm paying taxes that help to build roads in Milwaukee, not necessarily the road directly in front of my property.
Yeah, true. So some people would say, and so kind of the counterpoint to this is that when you're giving someone 100% property tax abatement, so they don't have to pay property taxes, they are essentially not paying into that system that Dan just described, right? So, however, when it becomes something that we believe that the city definitely needs, we're in a housing crisis and it's something the city values and wants to pursue, we're saying we're willing to let them, in economics, it's called free riding. Well, we're willing to let these property owners free ride because we believe that they're providing a benefit that not many people would pursue.
Thank you. And then from Morgan, when is the money from the CET collected?
It's collected on a project by project basis. So actually it's received at the building permit counter. So when you actually apply for permits, so our building official and our building techs take in the CET.
Great, thank you. On to the next one.
Yeah, good questions, guys. Thoughtful folks out there. Next slide if there's no more questions. Land banking and opportunity sites. So the city has, over the years, designated several sites throughout as opportunity sites. And these are most often sites that the city has some control via land banking. So land banking is essentially the city buying property and holding that property and having control of that property. And the reason the city does that is to create more private and public partnerships to get what the city wants on those properties. So for instance, you can go to the next slide, Dan. These are just a list of a few of them. I'm going to hit every single one of them right now. So the Coho Point project, which you may or may not be familiar with, that's downtown. It's next to the Axle Tree. So that's McLaughlin right in front of it, as in that picture. And so the city owns 3 of the 4 parcels on that lot right next to Kellogg Creek. And the city has partnered and selected a developer, BlackRock, to basically build out a 5-story multifamily, well, 6-story if you count it, the subterranean, multifamily, 195 units, multifamily. 10% of those units are going to be held at 80% of AMI and restricted for 30 years. So affordable housing component for those making 80% of the area median income. Shared parking agreement. So the parking that's within this development will also be at least quite a few, almost half of those will be available for the public at large. There's a pathway connecting Kellogg Creek and McLaughlin up to Dogwood Park. So it's creating some connectivity that there wouldn't be There's also they're using Path to Net Zero, so they're going to be developing this using a green building standard, which again is another. So the city is able to help develop and work with this developer in order to create what we couldn't do. We couldn't develop. The city really is. We want to think we could do something like this, but it's better if we partner with folks and try to get leverage the expertise out there. And an interesting thing about this property is that it's in a floodplain. It's going to take a heck of a lot to get what you see there constructed. And they're working with FEMA, the developers working with FEMA. There's going to be they put a lot of money into this project. There's a retaining wall that's going to be an engineering marvel that the developer's taking on. That this will actually provide a lot of public, outdoor public space that will attach to Dogwood Park, as Dan knows, as he's doing events down there. It's going to make the space much more connected to Kellogg Park and Dogwood Park, Kellogg Creek and Dogwood Park. So that's one thing. We're currently in the process of this, received its entitlements. So it's gone through the planning process. Hopefully, we're still working on a couple other agreements with them in order to ensure that they stay and fulfill their requirements. So we're working through this, but hopefully you'll see this break ground probably next year. You can move to the next slide. Dan. This is what we call the Sparrow site. So it's McLaughlin, it's Island Station neighborhood. City purchased this little triangle property from TriMet not long ago, I guess. I would say within 6 years ago, I want to say. Dan's smiling, so I'm saying, yeah, that sounds good. 6-7 years ago.
2017. It was all
It's everything. It's 2017.
Now this was purchased in the lead up to light rail coming in. So I would guess probably 2014, 2015.
Yeah. Okay. So city purchased this property from TriMet. It was a staging area. It needs some need from brownfield remediation. So it has some issues. It's really hard to access. There's it's going to be a difficult property to actually develop in any way. But I can say that the city's intention, city council's intention of purchasing this was to build at some point a affordable housing project that helps 30% and low AMI. So we're talking extremely low income folks that need housing, and using sustainable building practices to do so. Right now, we're also looking at another property to purchase just to the south of this, another TriMet site in order to help with access. But again, this is going to be, there's a lot of slope, there's natural resources to the north. It's a tricky site. So, and the city's not going to, again, be the developer on this, or it's going to have to be a partnership with somebody that knows what they're doing and can manage a lot of this nuance. So I guess no big update besides the fact that the city does have site control here. Next slide. So across the street from the current city hall is Harrison and Main. It's a parking lot. You'll know it for its Sunday farmers market. That's where the farmers market is. The city owns about 2/3 of that parking lot, and then the other third is owned by Metro. So we have site control, and we are unsure about what it's going to be, but it's going to be transit-oriented development most likely. So TOD, so it's just development close to transit. So most things that get built downtown are now close to transit, at least a quarter mile or walk or so. Income restricted affordable housing is also, again, a desire, and mixed use would be required anyway as part of the zoning. So I don't think there's not really an update here, but just so you know, the city owns this, does have some desire and plans to work with Metro and create some kind of mixed use development at some point in the medium future. And I'm a shout out to our friends at the county housing authority. They have just got past the Hillside Master Plan by our city council. I feel like last month or month and a half ago. It's across the street from the hospital on 32nd. And right now it's about 100 units of affordable housing, if I remember correctly. And this is quite a substantial development. This will have mixed use, multifamily components, attached housing components, commercial as well. And they're trying to get money, and the city has helped them get money to create as many affordable units as possible. And they're still right now, they just went down an RFP for a developer. So they're looking for developers, and you should see some stuff happening probably more about this over the next year or so. I just wanted to put that one out there. We helped a little bit, but and it's a big deal. It's actually a huge deal. And lastly, this is the last slide, guys. Thank you for being here. I'm going to land on City Hall because these are important projects. Remember I was saying that all like kind of the public parcel side of things, any kind of development on public parcel, public lands is typically comes through the community development department. So I'm spearheading the old City Hall, or the current City Hall, and what its next phase will be, what its next life will be. For those that don't know, the city purchased the Advantis Credit Union building about a block north. Advantis has that building until the end of the year, and then the city is planning on moving into that building 2023 sometime. I work at Johnson Creek Boulevard building, so I don't even work at City Hall. And so this is kind of the reason that we're moving, is to consolidate and to actually all be in one building and hopefully serve the community better. And so that leaves this beautiful building, at least on the outside, guys. I think the outside is exceptional. I love it. The inside is a little bit, it needs some love. Dan, if you agree.
The inside's weird and I love it. And anybody who doesn't like a building with wasps' nests in the ceiling, then I mean, I just don't even want to know that person.
Sounds like a horror movie.
That's insulation.
It's all right. Well, it's buzzing. So
hey, it's sustainable insulation. I like it. It's Mother Nature helping. Yeah, so we're moving. And so the city has done quite a bit of engagement. We had a blue ribbon committee kind of talk about the next phase and what it wanted to see. And we created these 5 goals with that blue ribbon committee. And it was just these goals were adopted by council in last October. And so when we do transition, we're gonna have to do a surplus property hearing. I'm hoping to have that in April, and then send out an RFP, a request for proposal, for the next owner, leasee of City Hall. And I can tell you that there's a lot of ideas of what it should be. But we're definitely gonna go through a process to see who actually has a good, well-funded thing that they can actually go the long distance with. And we want, again, you can read these adopted goals. I think they're great, but I'm happy to answer any questions too. But hopefully when we move out of there, something really neat will take its place, keep the historic facade forever, and but create a destination and do some good in
we'll throw in the wasps for free.
Yeah, wasps for free. Thank you, guys. Any questions? Happy to answer.
I have a really quick question. That so the old City Hall building with wasps in it, that's a public building. That's public property, correct? So then, but anything can come in there, like a private business.
Yeah. So whenever the city has a building or a property that it deems as it no longer needs, it's called they go through a process called surplus property hearing. So basically the city will designate it as a surplus property, and then throw out a request for proposal, basically asking for anybody that wants to throw out an idea of what they want to do, as long as it meets these goals and it's graded on such and such preferences. Anyone can submit their ideas, and then we'll have a committee come together to kind of judge those ideas, and then we'll take those finalists to council for their final approval. So to answer your question, yes, that's the short answer is yes. But also there is definitely some hoops to jump through in order to get to the end.
Is Dark Horse going to get that building too?
I know that they have wanted to create a museum, but I'll tell you, there is so many different ideas out there. and there's already interest. I can tell you guys, there is quite a bit of interest in our.
What if community members want it? Like, I just had my first tree lighting ceremony. What if I'm not willing to give that up? That sounds sad.
Yeah, then you should show up to the surplus hearing and say, no, we should keep this forever. And
Cool.
speak your piece.
We've got a couple of, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. All good. We've got a couple of questions. I see folks have their hands up. We also have one in the chat from Emily. Can you share what some of the ideas are? And I think, I don't want to speak for Emily, but I think really the question is, which grocery store is it? Come on, just tell us.
I don't know. I don't. I swear.
Good enough.
I promise. I promise I don't know.
But do you have, I mean, is there anything that you can share about things that people have proposed for using the current City Hall building for?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can share that. You know, we've had brew pubs, we've had art museums, we've had nonprofits, we've had a lot of different people poking around. You know, whether they're actually put something together that makes sense and is actually, you know, financially viable. Because the last thing we want to do is sell to somebody who will go bankrupt and then give the building over to who knows what else, and you know, then all of our goals are, everything else is gone. So there's a bunch of people. The sharks are swirling. The sharks are swirling. I believe we'll get something really neat, but I also know that it's very subjective.
We have a couple of hands raised. I think that Rebecca was first. Rebecca, if you'd like to go ahead and go.
Yeah, I vote for McMinimans because they do a great job with historical properties, and I've lived in many neighborhoods where they have, and they're great destinations, so great stewards of Oregon properties. But that's not my question. My question was whether you and your sort of department has any relationship to the current development of the pedestrian bike lanes around on 42nd and 43rd, and then the newly completed one on Linwood, and whether or not that has a relationship to zoning, or any shifts in use, in land use.
And Joseph, if I could jump right in there, we're going to hear a lot more about that stuff from engineering next month. So,
Okay.
by all means, share what you've got. But for anybody who feels like, I want to know more about these paths, I want to know more about that work, we've got the city engineer coming in March.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I was going to say those projects are mostly overseen by our city engineer, who sounds like it's going to be here shortly, at least in a month, talking to you all. And I will also say that it's related to planning and community development because as Laura talked about long-range planning, the transportation system plan, which is, I get it's super wonky, TSP is for short. That is a plan that we are currently updating, or at least working towards updating, that designates what every street is supposed to look like eventually in the city. So that's not necessarily connected to, it's connected to land use to a certain extent, but it's not directly connected in a sense is that this can or can't be a road. It's just the size, the dimension, bike lanes are a part of it, sidewalk. There's different, forget what they call it, just different street designs.
I think we have time for one more question before we go into our aha moments. Morgan?
Yes. I was wondering on the public-private partnerships, you know, to build these newer complexes and developments. What's sort of your process for who we decide to partner with? And like, are there a lot of different options? Is the BlackRock group, like the only game in town? How do we vet them, I guess?
Yeah, good question, Morgan. So generally speaking, it's similar to what I kind of described with the city hall process. So essentially, when the city has property that, you know, wants to develop and work with somebody, they'll send out a request, either called request for qualification, so an RFQ, or request for proposals, RFP. Sometimes they can do both in one. And so for Coho, the project you're kind of speaking to with BlackRock as the developer, the city solicited that, sent that out, and within that RFP, RFQ, it designates what the city wants, what the city council designated as things that are important in a developer, and what kind of public benefits would be scored higher than others that are competing. So it's a competitive process. We tried to make it as objective as possible in the sense of actually creating scoring around different sections, whether it's sustainability, financial ability, past portfolio and experience, sustainable practices, subcontracting to women and minority owned businesses, things like that. So they'll have to kind of show who they are. And then the city creates a group of a committee that selects and judges, creates scoring, and then they talk about, who got the highest scoring, and that highest scores go to council for discussion and final selection. And then that's usually how you get a BlackRock at the end.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Joseph, for your time this evening, and thank you everyone for being here. I think we've got time for some aha moments. If anybody would like to share a thing they learned tonight that they didn't know before.
You guys?
I'll jump in and just say that's the first time I've actually seen a picture of what's proposed for the Coho site. I was in a bunch of those early meetings where we were talking about it, but I never actually saw what it turned into.
I had no idea about the City Hall project, and that seems enormous for Milwaukee's future, because it is so central and so kind of iconic, even if it's got wasp nest. But it feels like, in terms of downtown, what makes a there. So I hope there will be I guess so. This is maybe for next time, but I still feel like I don't fully understand how those decisions are going to unfold. I mean, whether it just goes to the highest bidder, or whether there's, the degree there's community input. So I'm curious. I will be curious about that in the future.
And what we can do too, and so the email that went out earlier today reminding everybody about this class included Joseph's email address and Laura's. They were both CC'd on it. So for folks who do have additional questions, please reach out to them, and I'm sure that they'll be happy to follow up with you and to have those ongoing conversations. They volunteer for the class, but then they end up with follow-ons, and that's good. That's what they're here for.
Yeah. Morgan, Amy, no aha moments from tonight?
Maybe not.
Okay.
Arlene, I think you might have our last one. What's your aha?
That Oregon is unique at the state level, that they've created urban growth boundaries, and not every other state did that or does that. I was boundaries and didn't know it was a unique concept to Oregon, or of course, I think that's cool.
There it is.
So Dan, before we launch out of here, a couple points. I love pointing this out, but three of the biggest actors in the adoption of Senate Bill 100 back in the day that established Oregon's planning program really were Republicans. And I like to point that out to people. The other thing, just to follow up, that Dan's going to be sending out some links to some things that Amy actually provided us early on about vertical landscaping, a pretty cool TED talk from an architect in Seattle. We kind of missed a timing opportunity with the public works presentations, but it goes just as well with the planning stuff too.
Thanks for the reminder, Stefan, and that is on my calendar for tomorrow morning. So that will get out. And thanks to Amy for providing those resources. Really interesting stuff.
Yep.
And I think that might be that. So it is 8 o'clock. Again, thank you all so much for being here. We're going to be back online 1 month from tonight on March 16th, when we'll hear from the Police Chief Luke Straight and our City Engineer Steve Adams. Thank you all so much. Be safe. We'll see you next month.
Good night.